Awakening is the beginning of the spiritual journey, not the end. It's the first real insight into non-dual reality, the sense that we're all one, that reality is one. It's an important insight that we get at the beginning of the journey where we get a glimpse of it. In Zen, that's called Kensho, a glimpse of this oneness. And that's the beginning of the journey because until we're fully established in that consciousness, we're not done yet. The goal is liberation. When liberation occurs, we're done. That's ego death. There's no more suffering after that. What's been established is the awareness of the unborn, the unmanifest reality. And it's free of suffering. And that's what we are. That's what this is, regardless of the appearances that arise. So we, in a sense, have realized that which transcends suffering entirely. And we no longer cling to the appearances. These appearances are caused by clinging to thoughts, attaching to thoughts. What we're taught conventionally is that who we are is separate from what we call God, that there's a duality. There's a duality between us and other people, us and other objects, us and the world. But the fundamental one, spiritually speaking, is the duality that is taught to us, inculcated into us at an early age, that we have a self and that we have this transcendent deity that we call God, and that we're separate, and that we need the church to connect the two. The word religion comes from the Latin root that means to tie back together like a ligature. A surgeon will take a suture and tie back two parts, will stitch it back together, two parts that have been severed. So religion is meant to reunite us. They're separate, it puts us back together. And the church is that structure, the rules, the forms, the relationships, the traditions, and yes, the dogmas too. The main dogma being that we're separate to begin with. So the teachings on non-duality are attractive to many because for the first time, there's a realization that we're actually already one with God or with reality, with the divine. The teachings on non-duality say it's not to. So from the Sanskrit Advaita, it means not to, which means we were never separate to begin with. So that's really good news. The word gospel means good news. I'd say that's better news than what most people consider the gospel to be. That salvation is possible. Like you're separate and you can find some kind of reconnection. We're getting rid of that because it's not necessary. So the direct realization is that who we are in our essence is already one with that, meaning that's all there is. It's reality. God, truth, being, reality. One essence appearing as a duality or proceeding from duality, what you might call a multiplicity of objects. Once you have two, then you have three and four, and then a seeming infinite number of objects that one has to deal with. The primary object being self, which is reified by a tendency that I call ego. That's the main attachment, is an attachment to a false idea of who we are. And it's taught to us by the church, by our parents, by our fathers and the fathers before them, and so on into antiquity for most of us, to some degree or another. Usually to quite an extreme degree, we're taught that we're separate. And it's really depressing. That's where suffering comes from, is this lie we're told that we're separate from God, from truth, from reality, from being. It's what is, and it's also who or what we are already. That's brilliant. So when we get that first glimpse, we hear the teachings on non-duality. It could be Advaita Vedanta, which is the traditional Hindu form of it, or it could be a teaching like Zen or Dzogchen, it could be Buddhist. It's basically suggesting or teaching, pointing toward this reality. Whatever we call it, it's one reality. And it appears as this multiplicity of objects. So that initial glimpse is important, that initial realization, if you will. Even just the insight, something in us, it's like a spark or a recognition that that's true. That's really important. That's the beginning. The rest of it is deepening and stabilizing that insight through practices such as meditation, or it doesn't have to be that formal. It could be inquiry or reflection. Like as we go through our day, who am I? The question arises, who am I? We're reflecting on this sense of self, and it relaxes when we develop more insight, this selfing tendency that I'm calling ego. It's a habit. And I'm making this gesture like it's a habit of clinging, of grasping. And the question, who am I, allows us to reflect in a way where we see that it's just a mental habit and it relaxes and eventually goes away entirely. So we stabilize and deepen that. That's what we're learning to do. A big part of this is, how do we live? People may have this initial insight, oh, I am one with all that is. It's powerful. It's a powerful insight. And there are varying degrees of depth of that insight. The point is to continue deepening that insight until, as the Zen master Lady Chio realized and expressed in her famous poem, she was carrying a bucket of water, and the bamboo that was holding it together had weakened over time. And one day the bottom fell out. There's no more water in the bucket, no more reflection of the moon in the water. And that was her realization. It was a poem about emptiness, really. Emptiness being utter freedom when this grasping tendency is completely surrendered and, in a sense, dies. That perception, that sense, that attachment to self goes away entirely. That's what we call liberation. It can be confusing. The word awakening generally refers to the process of awakening leading to liberation. The liberation itself can be called awakening, say with a capital A. Or it could be the Sanskrit word moksha, means liberation. Sometimes that's used. Nirvana, different words for it. How we live matters. So whether we just had that initial insight or trying to stabilize and deepen it, or whether we completely woke up to that deathless reality that we are, the question of how to live is always there. People generally have practical questions about it. Like, okay, I've realized this truth, and there's some degree of it. How do I do this? Or what do I do in this situation? It's usually a moral question or a practical question. What do I do for a job? How much money do I need? How do I find love? Or I feel depressed. How do I deal with that? I'm struggling in life. What do I do? And often a non-dual approach could be to say, so you're asking the question, what do I do? Well, it's that sense of I. The I is a false sense of self, and that's where the struggle comes from. And that's true. It's just there's varying degrees of realization from which that guidance comes. I think in the beginning it's tempting to put forth a one-size-fits-all guidance of just realize that the self is false, or ask to whom does it arise, or who is struggling. I'm not saying that's bad advice necessarily. It's just a bit glib sometimes if someone's depressed and struggling. To say, just realize that that self is empty, or ask yourself who is struggling, is not enough. It's facile. So how do we care about people who are in pain? How do we support them? How do we encourage them to practice in a way that will help them realize the end of their suffering? These are all valuable questions. It is possible to have this initial insight, this Kensho, and continue to suffer from depression and sadness and difficulty and have emotional struggles. It is entirely possible and very common. What happens is we imagine ourselves to be this person, and that what we call God or the absolute, we get this insight that we're one with it, and yet we still feel separate. There's this insight that, in a sense, glows within us. We return to it, we practice, and we recognize that, and it informs our life and the decisions we make and so on. It's like a figure ground reversals. It's as if there's this absolute essence that we're trying to get to, and that here's the self and here's God. And we learn that they're one, and it gets a little closer. And we realize the truth of that oneness, but we haven't realized it fully yet. There's still this tendency, this grasping tendency, and this argument with reality. Again, reality is just what's happening now. And when we argue with it, as the teacher Byron Katie says, when I argue with reality, I lose, but only 100% of the time. The one thing we can't change is that what is. And when we argue with it in our thinking, we attach to thoughts that disagree with reality, and that's what causes suffering. So we have this insight, and that's the beginning. It's as if we're approaching this ground, if you will. There's a figure in a ground. And at some point, it's as if they merge and then reverse. We start out thinking that we're a separate entity that we call self, and that God is separate. We learn that the two are really one. And in some sense, we get closer and closer in our lived experience, in our realization. The realization grows and grows. And then liberation is this contracting tendency dies, goes away. And it's as if they flip. So I realize myself as that absolute essence that is. I am that. That's the statement. I am that. That's the realization. And the selves that appear, when I say selves, I mean just objects that arise. Pens. I'm aware of objects in my field of awareness. Who I am is awareness. In a sense, I am the ground, and the figures are now arising before me. Whereas before, I thought I was the figure, and the ground was something I was trying to merge with. It doesn't really happen that way, but that's what it feels like. We get closer and closer to God. What we get closer to is its realization that we're one. That's what brings us closer. And liberation, again, is as if one merges with the absolute, and then these objects are continuing to arise, and we realize they're not us. They're not real. By real, I mean who we are is reality, so that's the real. I define the real as that which is eternal and unchanging. So, for example, this pen, it's not eternal and unchanging. I could break it. Or you could easily imagine that it runs out of ink and then I throw it away. It ends up in a landfill, and over time it degrades and then becomes dust. It might take a while. It's made of plastic, but who I am is eternal and unchanging. So these figures arise. I'm just not one of them.